The frigid water stole Winifred Payton's breath as her body crashed into the creek, the betrayal of her once loyal mare still fresh in her mind as the icy current pulled at her heavy skirts. Colorado Territory in 1876 was unforgiving to those who underestimated its dangers. And as the spring melt churned the waters into a frenzy, she flailed against the unexpected power of the stream. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm her senses, strong arms plunged into the water, lifting her from the creek's greedy clutches. "You're not alone," a deep voice assured her, and Winifred blinked through soaked lashes to see a weathered face framed by sun-bleached hair, concern etched into features that had clearly weathered many Western seasons. Winifred sputtered, coughing up creek water as the stranger carried her to the rocky bank. His broad-shouldered frame shielded her from the biting April wind that now felt like needles against her wet skin. She'd only been in Colorado Territory for 2 weeks, sent west to live with her aunt after her parents' passing, and already the land seemed determined to claim her as well. "My horse," she managed between chattering teeth, looking around frantically for the dappled mare that had spooked at her rattlesnake and thrown her unceremoniously into the rushing waters. "She's grazing about a quarter-mile upstream," the man said, his voice steady as he set her down on a sun-warmed boulder. "Skittish thing took off like the devil himself was on her heels. I caught sight of her before I heard your splash." He shrugged off his worn leather coat and draped it around her shoulders. The residual warmth from his body enveloped her like an embrace, and Winifred clutched it gratefully around her shivering form. "I'm Preston Wade," he introduced himself, crouching down to her level. His eyes were the clear blue of a summer sky, a stark contrast to the dust and leather that seemed to define the rest of him. "Most folks just call me Prees. Winifred Payton," she replied, her voice steadier now despite her sodden state. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Wade. I fear I might have been in dire straits had you not come along." Preston's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Can't leave a lady to drown in Miller's Creek, especially not one brave enough to be riding these parts alone." His gaze traveled briefly over her drenched form, concern evident in the furrow of his brow. "We need to get you dry and warm. My cabin's not far from here." Winifred stiffened at the suggestion. Proper ladies didn't venture alone to strange men's cabins, no matter how dire the circumstances. Her aunt in Silverton would be scandalized at the mere thought. Reading her hesitation, Preston's expression softened. "My sister lives with me. Martha's got clothes that'll fit you well enough until yours dry. Or I can escort you to wherever you're staying, though you'll catch your death in those wet things before we make it anywhere proper." The sincerity in his voice, coupled with the practical truth of her situation, swayed Winifred. She nodded, clutching his coat more tightly around her shoulders. "Your sister's presence would be most appreciated," she admitted. "I was on my way to Silverton, to my aunt's home. I thought to explore a bit before arriving, but it seems the territory had other plans for me." Preston whistled, and to Winifred's surprise, a magnificent black stallion trotted into view from behind a stand of aspen trees. The horse nuzzled Preston's shoulder affectionately, a stark contrast to her own mare's betrayal. "This is Thunder," Preston said, patting the horse's neck. "He's steady as they come. I'll fetch your mare after we get you settled." With surprising gentleness for a man of his stature, Preston helped Winifred onto Thunder's back before mounting behind her. The propriety she'd been raised with in Boston screamed in protest at their proximity, but survival trumped decorum in this moment. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back as he reached around her to take the reins, and despite herself, she found the contact reassuring rather than alarming. The ride to Preston's cabin took less than 15 minutes, winding through stands of pine and aspen that occasionally opened to reveal breathtaking views of distant snow-capped peaks. The cabin itself was modest but well-built, with a small corral to one side and smoke curling invitingly from the stone chimney. A woman with the same striking blue eyes as Preston emerged from the cabin at the sound of hoofbeats, wiping her hands on a worn apron. Her expression shifted from welcome to concern as she took in Winifred's bedraggled state. "Martha," Preston called as he dismounted and reached up to help Winifred down. "This lady took an unexpected swim in Miller's Creek. Her name's Winifred Payton, headed to Silverton." Martha Wade hurried forward, her practical demeanor immediately putting Winifred at ease. "Goodness, you poor thing, come in, come in. We'll get you sorted in no time." She shot her brother a look. "Please, you go tend to Thunder and fetch the lady's horse while I take care of her." Preston nodded, giving Winifred a small smile before leading Thunder toward the corral. Winifred allowed Martha to guide her into the cabin, which was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and bright woven rugs that spoke of care and attention. "Let's get you out of those wet things," Martha said, leading her behind a screen in the corner of the main room. "I'll heat some water for a basin so you can wash up properly." Winifred's fingers fumbled with the tiny buttons of her sodden blouse, clumsy with cold and lingering shock. Martha noticed her struggle and helped with practiced efficiency, treating Winifred with the same matter-of-fact kindness she might have shown a sister. "Please didn't exaggerate about your swim," Martha remarked, eyeing Winifred's soaked clothing. "Miller's Creek is treacherous this time of year with the mountain runoff. You're fortunate my brother was out checking his trap lines." "Indeed," Winifred agreed, gratitude warming her voice. "I've only been in the territory a fortnight. I'm afraid I've much to learn about its dangers." Martha helped her into a clean flannel dress that was slightly loose but blessedly warm and dry. "Most newcomers learn the hard way," she said with a sympathetic smile, "though usually not quite so dramatically." Once changed, Winifred sat near the hearth with a steaming cup of coffee, her wet hair combed out and drying in the heat from the fire. Martha busied herself preparing what smelled like venison stew, the rich aroma filling the cabin and reminding Winifred she hadn't eaten since breakfast. The door opened, admitting Preston and a gust of cool air. He stomped his boots on the threshold before entering, his gaze immediately finding Winifred. Something in his expression softened when he saw her in dry clothes, safe by the fire. "Your mare's settled in the corral," he reported. "Skittish thing, but she's calmed down now. Checked her leg, looks like she might have stepped in a prairie dog hole before she threw you. She's favoring it a bit, but nothing serious." "Thank you," Winifred said sincerely. "You've been far too kind to a stranger." Preston shrugged off her gratitude as he hung his hat on a peg by the door. "No strangers in these parts, Miss Payton. Just neighbors we haven't properly met yet." The simple philosophy struck Winifred deeply. In Boston, neighbors lived adjacent for years without exchanging more than formal pleasantries. Here, this man had risked the swollen creek to save her without a second thought. Over Martha's hearty stew, Winifred learned that the Wade siblings had come to Colorado 5 years earlier after losing their small farm in Missouri to drought and taxes. Preston had worked the silver mines initially before saving enough to claim this small parcel of land where he now trapped, hunted, and occasionally guided prospectors through the mountains. "And what brings a Boston lady to Silverton?" Preston asked, his direct gaze both curious and respectful. Winifred set down her spoon, the weight of her circumstances suddenly heavy again. "My parents succumbed to influenza this past winter. My aunt, my father's sister, is my only remaining family, She married a mine owner and settled in Silverton some 10 years ago. "I'm sorry for your loss," Preston said quietly, and Winifred could tell from the shadows in his eyes that he understood grief intimately. "Thank you," she replied. "It's been difficult, but I hope to make a new start here." Martha reached across the table to pat her hand. "The West is good for new beginnings." As evening fell, it became clear that traveling onward to Silverton would be impossible before morning. The mountain trails were treacherous enough in daylight. In darkness, they were deadly. Martha insisted Winifred take her bed, while she would share the small loft with Preston. Despite her exhaustion, Winifred lay awake for some time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Colorado night, the distant howl of a wolf, the soft hooting of an owl, the creak of the cabin's timbers as they settled. So different from Boston's clattering carriages and fog horns, yet somehow comforting in their wildness. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Winifred's clothes had dried overnight, and though slightly wrinkled, were perfectly serviceable. Martha had pressed them with a heated iron and mended a tear in the sleeve that had occurred during her fall. "Your mare's leg looks better today," Preston reported over a breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, "but I'd recommend taking it easy on her for a few days." "Silverton's a good 4-hour ride from here." Winifred nodded, trying to mask her apprehension at the prospect of continuing alone. Her confidence in her riding abilities had been severely shaken by yesterday's mishap. Perhaps sensing her unease, Preston added, "I was planning to head into town anyway for supplies. I'd be happy to escort you if you'd allow it." Relief flooded through her. "That would be most kind, Mr. Wade." "Please," he corrected gently, "if we're to be traveling companions." The journey to Silverton was far less eventful than Winifred's previous day's adventure. Preston proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the region's history, from the Ute tribes who had first inhabited these valleys to the silver strikes that had drawn thousands westward in recent years. Winifred found herself captivated not only by the tales, but by the storyteller. There was something compelling about Preston Wade, a quiet strength and integrity that seemed as much a part of him as his sun-weathered skin and calloused hands. When they crested the final rise and Silverton came into view, nestled in its valley surrounded by towering peaks, Winifred felt an unexpected twinge of regret that their journey was ending. "It's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the scene below. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings and mining operations scattered along the valley floor, but the setting was magnificent. "Prettiest valley in Colorado," Preston agreed, his gaze fixed not on the town but on her face. When she turned to him, he quickly looked away, clearing his throat. "Your aunt's place, do you know where it is?" "Aspen Hill," Winifred replied. "My aunt wrote that it's the largest house on the north end of town with a view of Sultan Mountain." Preston nodded. "I know it. Edward Prescott's place. Your uncle built it after he struck silver in the Yankee Girl mine." The house, when they reached it, was indeed grand by Silverton standards, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and decorative gingerbread trim painted in fashionable colors. It spoke of wealth and permanence in a town where many buildings were hastily constructed and utilitarian. Winifred's aunt, Harriet Prescott, was a handsome woman in her 40s with streaks of silver in her dark hair, and the same green eyes Winifred had inherited from the Payton side. She rushed from the house as they approached, having apparently been watching for Winifred's arrival. "My dear girl, we expected you yesterday. I was about to send Edward to search for you." She embraced Winifred tightly before holding her at arm's length to inspect her. "You look well, if tired." "Who is your companion?" Winifred introduced Preston, explaining briefly how he had rescued her from Miller's Creek and provided shelter. She omitted certain details, the severity of her danger, the fact that she'd spent the night at his cabin knowing her aunt's sense of propriety might be offended despite the innocent circumstances. "We are deeply indebted to you, Mr. Wade," Harriet said, her tone warm but with an undertone that suggested she was already calculating how quickly she could politely dismiss this rugged man from her niece's company. "Please, you must stay for luncheon at least." Preston declined respectfully, citing business in town that couldn't wait. But before departing, he turned to Winifred. "Miss Payton, should you need anything guidance about the area, perhaps Martha and I would be happy to assist. Thank you, Mr. Wade." "For everything," Winifred replied, suddenly aware that she might never see him again, and finding the thought unexpectedly painful. As Preston rode away, Aunt Harriet led Winifred into the house, already chattering about the social connections she planned to establish for her niece. "The Hendersons have a son about your age studying law back east, but expected home this summer. And Judge Wilson's nephew is quite eligible." Winifred nodded politely, but found her thoughts straying to blue eyes and strong hands that had lifted her from the creek. She wondered if all men in the West were like Preston Wade, or if she had simply been fortunate in her misfortune. Life in Silverton quickly settled into a routine that was both familiar and strange to Winifred. Aunt Harriet, determined to ensure her niece maintained the social standing befitting a Payton, introduced her to the small but status-conscious society of successful mine owners, merchants, and professionals that formed Silverton's elite. Uncle Edward was a bluff, hearty man who had made his fortune through equal parts hard work and good luck. He treated Winifred with gruff affection, but was often absent, attending to his mining interests. The household was completed by a cook, a housekeeper, and a man of all work who tended the small stable and garden. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Winifred had no pressing responsibilities, no immediate worries. She found herself at loose ends, missing the purpose that caring for her ailing parents had provided. Despite the grief and exhaustion of those final months, 2 weeks after her arrival, Winifred was helping Aunt Harriet organize a small dinner party when a package arrived addressed to her. Inside was a book, a lady's guide to the flora of the Rocky Mountains, and a brief note. "Thought this might help you avoid any dangerous plants in your explorations. Your creek diving technique, while spirited, could use refinement. P.W." Winifred couldn't suppress her smile, running her fingers over the embossed cover. The gesture was thoughtful, practical, and tinged with the same dry humor she'd glimpsed during their brief acquaintance. "Who sent you a gift?" Aunt Harriet inquired, her tone carefully casual as she arranged flowers in a crystal vase. "Mr. Wade," Winifred answered truthfully. "The man who assisted me when my horse threw me." Aunt Harriet's hand stilled. "I see." While his assistance was certainly fortunate, Winifred, you must be cautious about encouraging attention from men of uncertain background. "He's a trapper and guide," Winifred replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "Hardly uncertain, my dear, you're new to the territory. Out here, a proper young lady must be even more vigilant about her associations than back east. Many men come west to escape complicated pasts." The implication stung, though Winifred wasn't entirely sure why she should care about her aunt's assessment of a man she barely knew. "I believe Mr. Wade to be honorable," she said simply, tucking the book under her arm and excusing herself to her room. That evening at the dinner party, Winifred was seated beside Francis Henderson, the lawyer son Aunt Harriet had mentioned. He was handsome in a conventional way, well-educated, and clearly accustomed to being considered a good catch. His conversation was pleasant if somewhat predictable, focusing on his legal practice and his opinions on territorial politics. "Miss Payton, I understand you've only recently arrived from Boston," he said as they were served the main course. "How are you finding our little corner of Colorado? It's breathtakingly beautiful," Winifred replied sincerely, "though I've had limited opportunity to explore properly." "Perhaps you would allow me to remedy that," Henderson offered smoothly. "I could show you some of the safer trails near town. With your aunt's permission, of course," he added with a deferential nod to Harriet, who beamed approvingly. The offer was perfectly proper, exactly what Aunt Harriet hoped for, and yet Winifred found herself hesitating. "That's very kind," she finally said. "I would enjoy that." 2 days later, Francis Henderson called with a handsome buggy to take Winifred on a tour of the valley. Aunt Harriet fussed over her appearance, insisting on a fashionable bonnet and gloves despite the informal nature of the outing. The housekeeper would accompany them as chaperone, seated discreetly at the rear of the buggy. The tour was pleasant enough. Henderson was knowledgeable about the area's development and pointed out various mines and claims that had produced fortunes. He was attentive and polite, if somewhat self-important in his observations. As they were returning to town, the buggy rounded a bend in the road to reveal 2 riders approaching Preston Wade and a silver-haired man Winifred didn't recognize. Preston reined in his horse, his expression brightening with surprise when he spotted her. "Miss Payton," he greeted her, removing his hat. "A fine day for a drive, Mr. Wade," she replied, aware of Henderson's curious gaze. "Yes, indeed. Mr. Henderson has been kind enough to show me some of the valley." Preston nodded to Henderson, who returned the gesture stiffly. "Wade," the lawyer acknowledged, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been moments before. "This is Benjamin Gray Wolfe," Preston said, gesturing to his companion. "Best tracker in the territory and my friend." The older man, whose weathered face spoke of native heritage mixed with European, touched his hat brim to Winifred with quiet dignity. Mr. Gray Wolfe," Winifred responded, earning a surprised but approving look from Preston. Many whites in the territory barely acknowledged mixed blood or native residents, let alone address them with courtesy titles. "We're escorting some Eastern investors to a potential claim site," Preston explained. "Just passing through town for supplies. Will you be staying long?" Winifred asked, ignoring Henderson's slight shift of disapproval beside her. "A day or two," Preston replied. "Martha asks after you, says you're welcome any time you'd like to escape town life for a spell." Before Winifred could respond, Henderson cleared his throat. "We should continue, Miss Payton. Your aunt will be expecting us for tea." Winifred nodded reluctantly. "Please give your sister my regards, Mr. Wade, and thank you for the book. It's most informative." Preston's smile reached his eyes. "Glad to hear it. Safe travels, Miss Payton." As they rode on, Henderson waited only until they were out of earshot before commenting. "I wasn't aware you were acquainted with Wade." "He assisted me when I had an accident on my journey to Silverton," Winifred explained. "He and his sister showed me great kindness." Henderson made a noncommittal sound. "Wade knows these mountains better than most, I'll grant him that. Makes a decent living guiding prospectors and hunting parties, but he's not the sort one typically socializes with." The dismissive assessment rankled. "And what sort would that be, Mr. Henderson?" Perhaps sensing her displeasure, Henderson backpedaled slightly. "I simply meant that he moves in different circles. No formal education, no family connections of note, lives on the fringes of society by choice, from what I understand. Sometimes one finds the most interesting perspectives at the fringes," Winifred remarked, gazing out at the mountains rising majestically around them. wild and indifferent to human notions of status. The remainder of the drive passed in stilted conversation, and Winifred found herself relieved when they returned to her aunt's home. Henderson's company, which had been pleasant enough before their encounter with Preston, now felt stifling in its conventionality. That evening, unable to settle, Winifred took Preston's book onto the porch and sat reading by the last of the day's light. The detailed descriptions and careful illustrations of alpine flowers, medicinal plants, and poisonous varieties captured her attention, but even more engaging were the occasional penciled notes in the margins, observations in Preston's neat, surprisingly educated hand. "A pleasant drive with young Henderson?" Aunt Harriet inquired, joining her on the porch with a shawl against the evening chill. "Yes, thank you. He was most informative about the mining operations." Harriet looked pleased. "He comes from excellent stock. His father built the largest mercantile in Durango before expanding here. They say Francis may run for territorial legislature next year." Winifred made a noise of acknowledgement, turning a page in her book. "I understand you encountered that trapper again today," Harriet continued, her tone carefully neutral. "Wade, was it?" "Yes. He was passing through with a guide and some investors," Winifred replied, deliberately casual. "Edward says Wade is reliable enough for backcountry work. Not like some of the rough elements around the mines." Harriet smoothed her skirts. "Still, my dear, a young lady in your position must be mindful of appearances. Especially after your recent loss, people might misconstrue friendly interest as something more significant." Winifred closed her book, marking her place with a pressed columbine she'd found on the roadside. "I'm simply grateful for his assistance when I was in need, Aunt. Nothing more." But even as she spoke the words, Winifred knew they weren't entirely true. There was something about Preston Wade that lingered in her thoughts: his quiet competence, his unexpected gentleness, the way he treated everyone, from his sister to Benjamin Gray Wolfe, with the same straightforward respect. 3 days later, Winifred was shopping in town when she quite literally bumped into Martha Wade outside the general store, nearly dropping her parcel of fabric and notions. "Miss Payton," Martha exclaimed, steadying her with a friendly hand. "What a pleasant surprise, Mrs. Wade," Winifred replied warmly. "Please call me Winifred. How lovely to see you again." "Then you must call me Martha," the other woman insisted. "I've been hoping to cross paths with you. How are you settling into Silverton life?" The simple question, asked with genuine interest rather than social formality, opened a floodgate. Before Winifred quite realized it, she and Martha were seated at the small cafe beside the general store, sharing tea and conversation as if they'd known each other for years rather than days. "I'm grateful for my aunt and uncle's generosity," Winifred confided after describing her daily routine. "But I confess I feel purposeless. In Boston, even in the midst of grief, I had responsibilities, patients to visit with the Ladies' Aid Society, my parents' affairs to settle." Martha nodded understandingly. "The West doesn't much cotton to idle hands even for ladies. Perhaps you need an occupation. What would you suggest? There are limited opportunities for unmarried women, even here." Martha's eyes lit with inspiration. "The school teacher, Miss Collins, is expecting a child and plans to leave her position at term's end next month. The town council is seeking a replacement. With your Boston education, you'd be well qualified." The idea took root immediately in Winifred's mind. She had always enjoyed children, and while she'd never formally taught, she had often helped younger students at her finishing school with their lessons. "You think they would consider someone with no teaching experience?" she asked hesitantly. "Anyone who can read, write, and cipher is ahead of half the prospectors in these mountains," Martha replied with a laugh. And from what Pries mentioned of your conversation during your ride to town, you're educated well beyond that." At the mention of Preston, Winifred felt a now familiar warmth in her chest. "How is your brother? Keeping busy?" "He's been contracted to guide a geological survey team through the San Juans for the next few weeks." Martha's gaze was knowing. "He asked after you before he left." Winifred busied herself with her teacup, hoping the flush she felt rising in her cheeks wasn't obvious. "He was very kind during my misadventure." "Kind isn't usually the first word people use for my brother," Martha said with a small smile. "Capable, reliable, stubborn as a mule, those come up more often. But yes, he can be kind when it matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Harriet Prescott, who had been visiting the milliner across the street and spotted her niece through the cafe window. Her expression when she saw Winifred's companion was politely puzzled. "Aunt Harriet, may I present Martha Wade? She and her brother assisted me after my accident on the journey here," Winifred explained. "Martha, my aunt, Mrs. Edward Prescott." The women exchanged greetings, Harriet's manner correct but reserved, Martha's friendly but dignity not lacking. After a moment of awkward small talk, Harriet reminded Winifred of an engagement that afternoon, effectively ending the conversation. As they walked home, Harriet waited until they were out of earshot before commenting, "The sister seems respectable enough, I suppose. A seamstress, is she not?" "Yes, Martha takes in sewing and mending," Winifred confirmed. "She mentioned the school teacher's position will be vacant soon." "I'm considering applying." Harriet stopped short. "A teaching position, but my dear, there's no need for you to work. Edward and I are more than happy to provide for you until—" She hesitated delicately. "Until I marry," Winifred finished for her. "Aunt Harriet, I appreciate your generosity more than I can express. But I need purpose, occupation. I cannot simply wait to be wed." Harriet studied her niece's face, perhaps recognizing for the first time the steel beneath Winifred's proper exterior. Finally, she sighed. "I suppose there is precedent. Mrs. Judge Wilson taught school before her marriage, but Winifred, teaching is hardly necessary for a young woman of your background." "Necessary for livelihood? No," Winifred acknowledged, "but perhaps necessary for happiness." The application process for the teaching position moved swiftly. With her excellent education and a glowing letter from her former headmistress, requested by telegraph at significant expense, Winifred was approved by the town council with little debate. She would begin after the current term ended in June, giving her a month to prepare. Aunt Harriet, having reconciled herself to the idea, now approached it with the same efficiency she applied to all challenges. She helped Winifred select appropriate teaching attire, and insisted on accompanying her to inspect the small but tidy quarters attached to the schoolhouse where the teacher traditionally resided. "You needn't live here, of course," Harriet said, eyeing the simple two-room accommodation dubiously. "You're welcome to remain with us." Winifred ran her hand along the pine shelves built into the wall beside the small stove. "I think I should like my independence," she said quietly. "This will suit me well." The decision wasn't entirely about independence, though that was part of it. Living in the school quarters would also free her from the social obligations that came with residing at Aspen Hill. Aunt Harriet's intentions were kind, but her constant efforts to introduce Winifred to eligible bachelors had become exhausting. Francis Henderson had called 3 more times since their drive, each visit more pointedly courtship than the last. He was unobjectionable in every way that should matter, well-mannered, established in his profession, clearly interested in her, yet Winifred found herself inventing excuses to avoid his company. As May turned to June, Winifred divided her time between observing Miss Collins's teaching methods and preparing the school quarters for her occupancy. The work was satisfying, giving her days structure and purpose. She found herself thinking less often of Boston, of the grief that had driven her west, and more about the future she might build in this wild, beautiful place. She had not seen Preston Wade since their brief encounter on the road. According to Martha, with whom she now took tea regularly despite Aunt Harriet's subtle disapproval, he was still guiding the geological survey and not expected back for at least another week. Winifred told herself her disappointment was merely friendly concern, nothing more. Yet she found herself watching the trail into town when she walked to the schoolhouse each morning, and her heart quickened foolishly at the sight of any rider who bore even a passing resemblance to the trapper. On her final evening at Aspen Hill before moving to the school quarters, Uncle Edward returned from a business trip to Denver with a visitor, a distinguished-looking gentleman in his late 30s, whom he introduced as Richard Blackburn, a mining investor from Chicago. "Miss Payton," Blackburn said, bowing over her hand with practiced charm, "your uncle has spoken highly of you but failed to mention your beauty." Dinner that evening was a somewhat formal affair, with Aunt Harriet at her most gracious. Mr. Blackburn proved to be well-traveled and articulate, sharing stories of Europe and the East Coast that made Winifred momentarily homesick for the cultural amenities of Boston. He showed particular interest in her plans to teach. "A noble profession," he remarked, "though surely temporary for a lady of your accomplishments and connections." Before Winifred could formulate a response that wouldn't betray her irritation at the assumption, they were interrupted by a commotion at the front door. The housekeeper entered the dining room, her expression flustered. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Prescott, but there's a Mr. Wade insisting on speaking with Miss Payton. Says it's urgent about her friend Mrs. Wade." Winifred's heart dropped. "Martha, what's happened?" Uncle Edward frowned at the interruption but nodded to the housekeeper. "Show him in, Agnes." Preston Wade appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, looking travel-worn and grim. His gaze found Winifred immediately, barely acknowledging the others. "Miss Payton, I apologize for the intrusion," he said, his voice tight with what she now recognized as carefully controlled worry. "Martha's taken ill mountain fever. The doctor's been, but she's asking for you. I wouldn't have disturbed your evening if it weren't serious." Winifred was on her feet instantly. "Of course I'll come. Let me get my shawl." "Winifred," Aunt Harriet protested, "surely this can wait until morning." "We have guests, and it's nearly dark. I'm sorry, Aunt, but it cannot wait." Winifred's tone was firm as she folded her napkin beside her half-eaten dinner. "Martha has been a dear friend to me. If she's asking for me, I must go." Mr. Blackburn stood politely. "Perhaps I might accompany you, Miss Payton, for propriety's sake." Preston's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "No need, sir. I've brought the wagon. We'll have Miss Payton back by morning." Uncle Edward, who had been studying Preston thoughtfully, nodded. "Go, Winifred. Martha Wade is a fine woman, and if she needs you, that's where you should be." He gave Preston a measuring look. "You'll see my niece safely home, Wade." "On my honor, sir," Preston replied, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Winifred hurried to collect her shawl and a small medical kit she had assembled from her experience caring for her parents. When she returned, Preston was waiting by the door, his posture tense with urgency. The wagon ride to the Wade cabin was swift and largely silent, Preston pushing the team harder than was strictly safe on the darkening mountain roads. Winifred clung to the seat beside him, questions burning in her throat but sensing now was not the time for conversation. Only when the cabin came into view, lamplight glowing from its windows, did Preston speak. "Thank you for coming." The doctor says it's not contagious, some kind of fever from a tick bite. But she's been out of her head since yesterday, calling for you between bouts of delirium." "I'll do whatever I can," Winifred promised, touched that Martha would ask for her in such a state. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of medicinal herbs. Martha lay in the bed behind the screen, her normally robust complexion alarmingly pale, her cheeks flushed with fever. A middle-aged woman Winifred didn't recognize sat beside the bed, wringing out a cloth in a basin of water. "Mrs. Thornton from the next homestead," Preston explained quietly. "She's been sitting with Martha while I fetched you." Winifred approached the bed, taking Martha's hot hand in her own. "Martha, it's Winifred. I'm here now." Martha's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever but focusing briefly on Winifred's face. "Winnie," she murmured, using the nickname she'd bestowed weeks ago. "You came." "Of course I came," Winifred replied, squeezing her hand gently. "Now rest." "I'll stay right here." The night that followed was one of the longest in Winifred's memory. Martha's fever raged, requiring constant attention, cool compresses, sips of water when she was lucid enough to swallow, herbal teas prepared according to Dr. Wilson's instructions when Preston fetched them from the kitchen. Preston himself refused to rest, maintaining a silent vigil in the corner of the room, moving only to bring fresh water or stoke the fire. In the small hours of the morning, when Martha finally fell into what seemed a more natural sleep, Winifred found herself alone with him while Mrs. Thornton took a brief rest herself. "The fever's breaking," she told him softly, relief evident in her voice. "Her skin is cooler and her breathing is more regular." Preston's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time Winifred saw the full extent of his exhaustion. He must have ridden hard to reach the Geological Survey camp, then back to town, and finally to fetch her, all without rest. "You should sleep," she urged. "I'll watch over her." He shook his head stubbornly. "I'm fine." "Preston," she said, using his given name for the first time, "you can't help Martha if you collapse yourself. Please at least sit down." Perhaps it was the use of his name, or simply that his reserves were truly depleted, but he acquiesced, sinking into the chair beside Martha's bed. Winifred moved to the hearth to prepare fresh tea, aware of his gaze following her movements. "You left your dinner party," he observed quietly. "Important guests from the looks of it," Winifred shrugged, measuring herbs into the pot. "Nothing more important than a friend in need. The gentleman didn't seem pleased about your departure." She glanced up, surprised by the hint of something like jealousy in his tone. "Mr. Blackburn." "He's a business associate of my uncle's, visiting from Chicago. I'd only just met him." Preston nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. After a moment he said, "Thank you for coming. Martha thinks the world of you." "And I of her," Winifred replied honestly. "She's been a true friend when I most needed one." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by Martha's now even breathing and the soft pop of embers in the hearth. Winifred found herself studying Preston's profile, the strong line of his jaw, now shadowed with several days' growth of beard, the weariness evident in the set of his shoulders. "I'm moving to the schoolhouse tomorrow," she said, surprising herself with the non sequitur. "Or today, rather." "I've accepted the teaching position." Preston's expression brightened slightly. "Martha mentioned you were considering it. That's good news. You'll make a fine teacher. You don't think it odd, a Boston lady teaching frontier children?" "I think those children will be fortunate," he replied simply. "Not everyone sees beyond circumstances to a person's true character, Winifred." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her, though she knew it was likely just exhaustion lowering the barriers of formality between them. Still, she found she liked the sound of it in his voice. "Speaking of seeing clearly," she said, changing the subject. "I've been using your book. I can now identify at least 20 local plants, including 3 that would likely kill me if consumed." That earned a genuine smile, transforming his weary features. "Useful knowledge in these parts. Though I'd prefer you avoid testing the latter category." By dawn, Martha's fever had broken completely, and she woke lucid and weak but clearly on the mend. Mrs. Thornton returned from her rest, insisting that both Winifred and Preston get some sleep themselves. "I should return to town," Winifred protested half-heartedly, though the thought of the jolting wagon ride in her exhausted state was far from appealing. "My aunt and uncle will be concerned." "I'll send my boy with a note," Mrs. Thornton offered. "You get some rest, child. You've earned it." Too tired to argue further, Winifred allowed herself to be led to a small trundle bed that had been prepared in the cabin's main room. She was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow, vaguely aware of Preston settling into a bedroll near the hearth. When she woke, the sun was high, suggesting it was well past noon. The cabin was quiet except for low murmurs from behind Martha's screen. Winifred sat up, smoothing her rumpled dress and attempting to tidy her hair, which had come loose from its pins during the night. Preston emerged from behind the screen, a relieved smile on his face. "She's asking for broth and bread," he reported. "Doctor says that's a good sign." "Wonderful news," Winifred said sincerely, returning his smile. "I should look in on her before I go." Martha was sitting propped against her pillows, still pale but with her usual spark returning to her eyes. "There's my Boston savior," she greeted Winifred weakly. "Pries says you kept the fever cloths coming all night." "Anyone would have done the same," Winifred demurred, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a buffalo herd," Martha admitted. "But better than yesterday. Thank you for coming, Winnie. I know it wasn't proper, having Pries fetch you after dark like that." Winifred waved away the concern. "Propriety matters little in emergencies. I'm just glad you're recovering." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you remember much from last night?" Martha's brow furrowed. "Bits and pieces. I remember asking for you, and—" She glanced toward the doorway where Preston had disappeared, lowering her voice. "I remember waking once to see you and Pries talking by the fire. The way he looked at you, Winnie." Winifred felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It was a long night. We were both exhausted." Martha hummed non-committally. "My brother doesn't look at anyone the way he looks at you, exhausted or otherwise." Before Winifred could formulate a response, Preston returned with a cup of broth for his sister. "Mrs. Thornton's boy brought word from town," he told Winifred. "Your aunt says to take all the time you need, and that they've moved your things to the schoolhouse as planned." That was surprisingly accommodating of Aunt Harriet, Winifred thought. Perhaps her uncle had intervened on her behalf. After ensuring Martha was comfortable and promising to visit again soon, Winifred prepared to return to town. Preston insisted on driving her, despite her protests that he should rest. "I've gone longer without sleep on hunting trips," he assured her, helping her into the wagon. "And I promised your uncle I'd see you safely home." The ride back to Silverton was more leisurely than their journey the previous night, the summer day warm and pleasant around them. Conversation flowed easily between them, touching on Martha's recovery, Winifred's teaching plans, and Preston's recent expedition with the Geological Survey. "They're mapping potential railway routes," he explained. "The terrain's challenging, but there's talk of connecting Silverton to Durango within a few years." "That would change things considerably," Winifred observed. "For better or worse?" Preston considered the question seriously. "Both, I expect. It would bring more people, more commerce. Make it easier to get supplies ship or. But it would change the character of the place too. some of the wildness would be lost. Is that why you live outside town? To preserve that sense of wildness, he glanced at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Partly. I've never been one for crowds, but mostly it's simpler out there. The mountains don't care about a man's background or education, only whether he's smart enough to respect them and skilled enough to survive them. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with being judged for his background. Winifred thought of Francis Henderson's dismissive remarks and felt a surge of indignation on Preston's behalf. People make too many assumptions, she said. In Boston, my worth was determined by my family name and the suitability of my manners. Here, it seems to be determined by one's proximity to the mines and their wealth. Neither truly measures a person's character. Preston's gaze on her was warm with something like admiration. No, they don't. Which is why it's rare to find someone who sees beyond those measures. The schoolhouse came into view as they crested a small rise, a simple white painted building with the teachers' quarters attached at the rear. Several trunks and boxes sat on the small porch. Winifred's belongings, delivered as promised. Preston pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down to help her alight, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment after her feet touched the ground, they remained standing close, his hands lingering perhaps a second longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you for your help with Martha," he said, stepping back, "and for not thinking twice about coming when needed." "I'm glad I could help," Winifred replied. "Please let me know how she progresses." He nodded, then hesitated, seeming to debate with himself before speaking again. "The town's holding a Midsummer dance at the end of the month, a fundraiser for the school as it happens. I was wondering if you might consider attending. With me." The invitation caught her by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. There had been something building between them, something neither had acknowledged directly until now. "I would like that very much," she said simply. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then I'll call for you that evening," he promised, climbing back onto the wagon seat. "Rest well, Winifred." As she watched him drive away, Winifred felt a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with possibility. The West was indeed good for new beginnings, just as Martha had said, and perhaps this beginning was the most promising of all. The schoolhouse would be her home, her purpose. But as she turned to unlock the door, she found herself already looking forward to the Midsummer dance, and to seeing what might bloom between her and the man who had lifted her from the creek with the promise she wasn't alone, a promise that, she was beginning to believe, might extend far beyond that moment into a shared future neither could have anticipated.